Okay, well, welcome everybody to Forecasting Group Behavior in Conflict Zones. Beneath that, as you see, is our info. If you want to take a look and talk to us what it's all about, I am your moderator and guide. I'm Bill Flavin, former Colonel, U.S. Army, former Assistant Director of the Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, and I'm happy to be part of this group here. Following here, I'm going to put up a slide of how you can contact us. There we are. As I'm talking, there's our contact information. If you want to contact any of us after the briefing and have further discussions, please feel free. Or looking at our website, please go to our website and get more information. We've all been in conflict-affected regions, faced with many actors who are essential to building peace. Knowing, understanding behavior, and being able to predict behavior, of course, as we know, is essential. And today we will discuss some tools that are available to assist, tools that have been developed in the recent times that may be of use to you. I'm going to introduce the key panelists here who will begin to discuss the need for this, how the tool was developed, how the tool has been field tested by our field testing folks, where individuals have been using the tool, and then throw this open to everyone for discussion, questions, ideas, and comments. The first speaker here is going to be Mark Ward, who is a career minister, a foreign service officer, worked in USAID for years in humanitarian assistance and development. He'll be followed by Peter Oakes, professor emeritus at the UVA Department of Religion. He is the director of field research and has developed the tool that we're going to be discussing. He'll be followed by Zain, who is a senior analyst from Pakistan who has used this tool in the field. And following him will be Paula Pinzon, who is a senior analyst who is located in Latin America, who will be able to talk about a further use of this tool beyond just a limited number of applications. So at this moment, I would like to turn this over. And at the end of this event, please, put your questions in the chat room, or if you want to talk, you can stick up your hand virtually or actually, and we will find out who you are and talk to all of us after this is over. I'm going to turn this over to Peter now.
Greetings, Mark.
Hi, everybody. I'm from Seattle. So my career was a little different than some of the other presenters you're going to hear over these couple of days. I was 35 years with USAID, with the State Department, also with the United Nations a couple of times, and then also ran a big humanitarian organization. And most all of these assignments were in conflict zones. And so, like the title of this conference, usually I was working beyond fragile ground. And now that I'm retired, trying to be retired, I'm very concerned with what I see as the steady erosion of our connection to people and communities in diplomacy and development over the course of my career. I mean, it's such a stark contrast to compare the contact that a foreign service officer had with people and communities when I joined the Foreign Service back in the late 80s with the way it was when I left and retired in 2017. And I'm worried that we're losing touch with the people and communities that we're supposed to be helping. And all of this pretty much post Benghazi because of security. If we keep relying on our usual sources for information, military calls it key leader engagement. If we keep relying on the same old people, we will repeat our failure in Afghanistan, where our so-called experts misread the situation badly. We have to stop relying on people who can get to us, people who can get past layers of security outside of our embassies these days, and start re-engaging with real people in real communities, because that's where our investments will work or not work. Going forward, I think we have to try a lot harder to ensure that what we do is welcome in the communities we're trying to help, know who our friends are and who our enemies are. As it is, we don't know which groups we can talk to make good decisions about how to spend our foreign aid money. And we don't know which groups are against us so that we can plan accordingly. And maybe decide, for example, that we should stay away from certain areas entirely because of groups in that area and their views about us or what it is we want to do. What difference does this make? It makes a lot of difference. Hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars have been wasted on projects that were dreamed up in distant capitals, like the one where a lot of you are sitting in Washington. Never discussed with the people who would actually be expected to benefit from, use, or maintain the project. Neglect by so-called beneficiaries at the local level has killed many, many projects. And if they weren't consulted about the project, there's a very good chance that's exactly what would happen. And of course, the worst case scenario is that that local community would actively oppose the project and work to destroy it. Our political leaders acknowledge that risk aversion overseas has become an impediment, but it's not going to change overnight, if ever. Despite nice words from Secretary Blinken and others, memories of Benghazi and what happened to Chris Stevens and his colleagues, and the political fallout in our very polarized country are, I think, still too strong to lead to any quick change. So how can this thing called VPA help? It's very simple. And that's why I decided to join the board of VPA. VPA can add to the tools we use to connect to communities by analyzing the language that groups living in those communities use where we plan to work, and then predicting their behavior. We've tested it with diverse groups in Pakistan, one of the most complicated and conflict-ridden places on earth. I've lived there myself twice, and it works. And my colleagues later in this presentation will explain the nuts and bolts of how it works. I mean, you could probably get the same insights about local communities that VPA can provide by painstakingly talking to those communities, listening to their parents' concerns, and building trust over many, many months. That's how we did it when I ran a humanitarian NGO in Afghanistan. But no donor, no company has that kind of time to plan. VPA can identify friendly and unfriendly groups much faster. So for the donors, the contractors, and the grantees, and companies with commercial interests. So they know from the get-go who their friends are, who their enemies are, and they can be that much smarter in planning their next steps. I want to keep this short so you can hear from the others on our team, but I thought it was important for you to hear from a retired practitioner of foreign aid how useful I think VPA can be for your organization.
Thank you so much, Mark. Indeed, we constructed VPA to address the very problems that Mark identifies. And we succeeded because of a surprising discovery. Before drawing your attention to this discovery, let me just warm up with a more informal description of what you're going to be hearing from three of us now. The tool that we've developed is based both on in-person language-specific study among peoples either in conflict or near them in the same language group. The study is also accelerated computationally as needed through online resources. So we can also receive large data, and we've developed algorithms to reproduce an analogy to what we do in the field for large data analysis. But we'll be describing to you today not the data science side just for time, but the kind of field work that generates manual results, and that will more easily in a presentation like this illustrate for you what we found. So we've succeeded in this work because of the following discovery: that there is a field testable correlation between the way a group, let me just make sure, between the way a group uses language and the way it will act toward other groups. Okay, so if you get your mind around it, groups use language. In particular, we're interested in the language spoken by group influencers or teachers. And there are certain signals in that language which we've detected over 12 years of work. And we found, surprisingly, not by theory, but simply by testing and observing, that those signals correspond to near future group behavior. We have not been able to, once we made the discovery about 10 years, 11 years ago, we weren't able to locate any other agency or academic or peace-building research group that forecasts group behavior in this way. So until we find partners like that, we've worked on our own, and we'll be describing to you what we've done. We discovered that the language of specifically identity groups, that is religious groups, ideological groups, ethnopolitical groups, any group whose members tend to share values that they describe, okay, that's what we focus on exclusively. We found that language use in those communities unintentionally sends out unique signals that can tell us how a group will probably behave toward other groups in the near future. What we call VPA is a tool for locating and decoding these signals. The signals are not sentiments, they're not feelings, warm or cold, and they're not beliefs. We're not interested in explicit terminologies that someone says violence or peace. We have to know those terms, but we're not looking at them. We're looking at something else. We're looking at strictly quantitative markers and the next language I'll use is informal, quantitative markers of how narrowly or loosely a group tends to define its key value terms. And here is how we find and decode such signals. If possible, we work through focus groups in the local language, or else through social media and online. We look for value judgments in the discourse of group influencers or teachers. We collect data on how, this is the key, on how many meanings, on average, group members associate with each significant value term. I'll give an example in a minute. We found that on average, a group may tend to associate a given value term. I'm going to talk about jihad, but it could be holiness or goodness or beauty, any term like that. We found that on average, a group may associate any one term with one single meaning, all members of the group, or maybe across the group, you'll find that there are two meanings given to that term, or three or four, and we found that it maxes out after about 8 or 9 meanings. We call the range a group may have from 1 meaning to 9 meanings, we call it a semantic range, that is the range of different meanings. Through 10 years of on-the-ground field work, we found that these average numbers from 1 to 9 signal 9 different types of near-future group behavior. For example, a group that gives only 1 meaning for each time, we found in most cases will tend to act aggressively toward other groups in its field of conflict. A group that offers 4 different possible meanings, we found that that group will tend to reason carefully about its interrelation with other groups, and so on. And then finally, we add to our diagnoses a range of 9 action recommendations. I mean, these recommendations must be discussed with on-the-ground peace builders. We can't, pre-tell a peace builder or peacekeeper how to operate, but we, from our experience, can suggest the kinds of actions that seem to be successful with any of the 9 groups. So let me illustrate now, finally, what I mean. In a Muslim community, a term like jihad may connote many different kinds of struggle. For example, a young man struggle to become consistently pious, or a civic group struggle to protect the rights of widows, or a violent struggle against an oppressive occupation, or other meanings. Now, if, for example, a community tended to make active use of all 3 or 4 meanings, we would assign the group a semantic range, an SRA, of 3 or 4, which we have found just by years and years of engaging such groups. We found that such groups tend to reason deliberatively and often carefully about how to engage with other groups. For such a groups, we would recommend that peace builders seek full bureaucratic engagement. But say, however, that in a time of social tension, one group of young men claims that the term jihad has only one meaning, a struggle against an enemy, or it could also mean the pursuit of piety. The issue is how many meanings. If it has only one, we would assign that group a semantic range of 1, which we have learned to associate with potentially aggressive behavior toward other groups, in which case we would recommend great caution by peace builders. Now, we're illustrating for you today only one of the tools we've developed, the one that's been most studied, but we have several tools. And in order for us to distinguish kinds of aggressive behavior, we have to triangulate a number of different tools that we're not discussing today. So to illustrate everything I've just said, here, for example, based on some of our large data sets, is a graph of a range of meanings. On the left, on the y-axis, you'll see the semantic range from 0 to 9. And on the x-axis, the number of documents. And this particular one goes on and on, past 14. Mayor Baba, which is if you're familiar with it or not, it's a aggressively anti-gay church in Kansas, often studied by peace builders. And look at this, look at these lines. Each document has between 1 and 2 meanings only consistently. For our data, that's a very consistent marker of a 1, of a very aggressive group. Mayor Baba, the name of a since deceased Indian spiritual leader, has a large international following. If you see his graph, it qualifies as 6 to 7, which means that his followers do not organize themselves in any corporate group. Their behavior tends to be individuated. And therefore, if you're engaging members, you're not going to have any out-group behavior really at all. Finally, to conclude my part of this presentation, here is a diagram we first shared 11 years ago with the US Department of State. Here we characterize, we're using some different language early on, but I'll translate it. Here we characterize our 9 linguistic signals. They would be 1, 2, 3. When I do this, do you see my hand? Do you see the marker? I don't know if you do. You do. So you get, we used to call it transition 1, 2, 3, and there are 3 in here, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We characterize these 9 linguistic signals down here as different kinds of normative language, that is, value language use. And we use the term undefined for semantic range of 7, 8, 9, that is, terms that have many, many different meanings. These are groups on the right side who strictly define a term. So we find that such groups are either threatening in an extreme way, a moderate way, or a mild way. And on top is just an illustration of some of the forms of engagement by peace builders that have been more successful with groups of this kind. I don't characterize here the extreme threat because that goes outside of peace building. Let's just say for peace builders, it's a non-intervention. there's nothing to be gained by peace builders for engaging such groups that we're talking about. But right next to them, maybe a 2 on our scale, traditional diplomatic engagement, all the way over here to group-specific peace building, and finally, groups far to the left need protection because if they're in a field of conflict, these groups are liable to predation by other aggressive groups, which leads me to the presentation by Zain Molvi, which will be on the detailed field work we've done in Pakistan. Zain.
Thank you, Dr. Oaks. So I think just to pick up from, I want to go back a bit to what Mark suggested earlier on, which is that we're really struggling to have a method for an advanced notification of how things might pan out in conflict areas. And we're looking for a mechanism that can give us the who to engage, how to engage, and very importantly, when to engage. And also in relation to other groups that might be, that might be in the proximity of a given group. And so what I want to do is to take this opportunity to present some snapshots from my experience in Pakistan applying this method in the field. Now, we had some success with forecasting a range of behaviors with a number of social groups. So it's not just, I think, religious or other groups, but a whole bunch of identity groups I'll be talking a bit about. So what I want to do is I want to highlight 3 lessons that we picked up from the field. The first lesson is that this approach can counter false expectations on likely candidates that one would imagine are primed for violent behavior. Right, so when we first conducted these tests in Pakistan, militant Islamism was on an all-time high. And right at the center of that, implicated in that process, in all of the popular discourses you'd find globally and locally, were the traditional seminarians, the madrasas, the traditionally trained Muslim scholars. And they were thought to be a hotbed of violence. But when we used this approach, we found something quite surprising, which is that we could actually see, even though one might think one could be thrown off by certain words that they might use, certain affects or sentiment in their speech. For instance, they would use the word jihad often to mean some kind of, resistance or struggle. But they would also typically use it for a number of other things, like Dr. Oaks mentioned. And it turned out, if we look at their graph, that they were consistently featuring at about 4 or 5 meanings, which we classify or characterize as highly stable groups that have the capacity to engage in multiple registers with different groups, that are dialogue intensive, that are communicative, in other words. And for that reason, probably good candidates for engaging in peace building exercises. And this is completely contrary to what the stereotype would have been. And here's another, I suppose, a counter example to that. We also discovered that religiously inclined groups, if you put them into non-traditional educational environments, such as in liberal arts universities or engineering university environments, they end up becoming a lot more narrow and inflexible in this range, and therefore are more likely to exhibit antagonistic behaviors in future. So that is an important lesson I think we picked up along the way. And so we really, we really expanded the work from that sort of, what we thought was a positive sign of the science or the method. And that brings me to the second lesson. And the second lesson that I want to emphasize is that we can, with a lot of confidence now, say that these linguistic behaviors that Dr. Oaks highlighted are in fact correlated with what we can anticipate how behaviors may pan out. And this is not just in relation to, some kind of rigid classification. X group is violent, Y group is not. But more like a nuanced way in which we can speak about their baseline states, as well as how they may respond to certain trigger events or issues, and as well as how they may relate to specific other groups in a given field. So over the years, we worked with actually a very large range, as Mark mentioned, of groups, which includes members of the legal fraternity, of the journalist fraternity, liberal human rights activists, even dissident seminarians, and of course, traditional seminarians of the kind that this particular slide demonstrates. Barelvis and Deobandis are 2 very, popular groups in that traditional grouping, right? And so if you look at this particular slide, you'll see that the seminarians that we're describing, although they have a nice stable baseline that you can find within the 4 and 5 range, which we classify as stable, you can see those dips and spikes. And those alert us that here are certain trigger events, or here are certain groups that they might be in relation with, which is causing them to change in their linguistic behavior. And that gives us a sort of an early detection capacity to be nuanced in how we judge what's going to happen. And this kind of brings me to my final point, which is in one sense a lesson, but also in one sense a hope. And that is that we believe we have a practical and fairly efficient early warning or detection system, a mechanism of providing advance notification for violent or conflictual behavior, but also one, and this is, I think, important for us, for recognizing potential collaborators and cooperative groups, and for making nuanced assessments and distinctions about which strategies are likely to work with which group, when, and with what, in what time range or in terms of what time horizon. So I think this belief, I believe this gets to the heart of what we want to offer to the broader vision with this Alliance for Peacebuilding, which is that our method goes beyond what we currently have in the field to do this kind of work. And I want to spend some time just to describe that a little bit. Presently, what we have is what is described as sentiment analysis. It's a way of saying, you evaluate the group discourse that you can find in, let's say, social media or other forms of media, and you just pick up on essentially hate speech. If you find a group that is, employing the term jihad and they're employing it for resistant struggle, you say, well, that's a hate speech-oriented group. But that only allows us to make these very binary kind of judgments, group violent or group non-violent. And we found through this method that you need to actually differentiate at plenty levels, because there are groups who could be using that word in that sense, which may trigger you, in terms of your sentiment, but it doesn't in fact correlate to behavior that would be violent. In fact, it correlates to behavior that could be alliance-oriented. And so this is a science we believe that gives us the capacity to be non-one-dimensional in that detection and in that strategization of how to work with such groups, and to make nuanced distinctions in the degrees of conflictual and cooperative behaviors, and also the environments where those things are most likely to work and which strategies would be most likely to work. So I think I want to hand over to Paula at this point. Paula, if you could just tell us other aspects of where we could apply this in other environments as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sane. Yeah, so as Sane, Professor Oakes, and some of our other speakers have commented, the core of VPA really is our ability to diagnose and predict near future behavior. But how can we move beyond conflict zones, beyond religious or value-driven groups? What other applications does VPA offer? There is a lot of examples that we can look through, one of them being, for instance, businesses. Because we specialize in a way in the early detection of security threats, we're able to provide this for enterprises that are operating in conflict settings or in complex social and political environments. So, for instance, we could offer our consultative services to a company that for the first time ever is going to do business in an area of the world that they maybe have not worked in before and therefore do not really know what to expect, or an area that may be having some form of political or social or other complex turmoil going on. We really are able to then allow and provide an extra sort of layer of additional security by analyzing potential logistical and security challenges to ground businesses or operations, and providing real-time solutions and for mitigating and managing these risks. Therefore, we're taking a very unique tool that can complement conventional products of security and other traditional companies. It's really an additional offer and benefit for different companies. This can encompass travel, again, to areas that are not beyond just for peacekeeping purposes, but it can also be for the businesses and for other different industries and organizations. And I'll take it back to Bill, who will continue to close our presentation.
Thank you very much. So now we're open to questions and thoughts and anything else we can have. I'm sure we can supply these slides to anyone who would like the slides. We'll put up our names and addresses again at the end of it, and you can email Professor Oates, and he can supply those slides to whomever wants them. Well, to start it out, let me ask a question of the group here myself. You talk about, taking a look at written material. How do you address folks that are not literate? How do you address folks that are, the people out there who have not gone onto social media and who have not written documents. Does it work well with that? I'll go to Zane and see what you have to say.
Yeah, it actually works really well with that because typically they're the ones who are most active with sermons. Bayans are the ones we used to know. It's sort of like edifying, spiritually edifying talks. They're very inclined towards that. Khutbas, Jummah khutbas are like Friday, sort of just before prayers, moral exhortations and speech. And it works really well with the speech because our method allows us to mine, just spoken language as well. It's not just written. And the other thing is that because a lot of these speeches are now, so you'd be surprised that while you're right, certain of them might not be very literate in written sense, they do post a lot of things online as far as speech is concerned. And so there is actually a very, very large cache of things that you can use for this purpose. But yeah, we've done this on speech and it works just as well, sometimes even better.
Very good. Very good. Questions from the group out there? Anyone else would like to raise their hand or talk about what's anything that we would like to discuss with the crew? If not, I'll ask another question of the whole thing. Sort of going behind the curtain and the mechanisms as to how this actually would work. It's more than just sitting around and receiving data from the crew. Doesn't this data has to be manipulated somehow in order to come up with these predictions? Professor Oates, maybe you can talk about how this is manipulated and where it's manipulated.
I shall. And then I see that Mika has a question that she's just raised.
Oh, okay.
But I'll speak first. Well, why don't we go to Mika first, and then I'll respond to your question.
Hi, all. Sorry, are you sure, Professor?
Oh, please go ahead.
Well, I was floored by the fact that it seems to be more related to intra-group cohesion, like as far as coming to consensus on what a definition is or something like that, rather than the valence of the definition itself. And to me, honestly, my first reaction is that is really scary because those things, intra-group cohesion is not necessarily always correlated with like the valence of what one is thinking or how a group defines something. Oftentimes, we find that groups are brought together by extreme events, and those could be extreme violent events. And so I would think that in cases like that, the definition might be of a given term might be more likely to be a violent definition or something like that. But what you guys are saying is that even if the definition is not violent, a group that has strong intra-group cohesion could still be more violent, right? Did I get that in a nutshell? Yeah, that's scary to me. So anyhow, it's Zane answered the question earlier, but that was just my comment on it and my thoughts on it.
Well, I'm stimulated to add a couple of sentences in response. Are you, Zane and Paula? I mean, Mika, that's just one of the juiciest questions you could bring to us. May I start, Bill? Well, I think I already did.
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, you've jumped, Mika. I mean, you've seen what we're doing so well that you've jumped into some of the other tools we're using that we're not describing now. One thing I'll mention, that another tool, which we call narrative analysis, correlates what we've just described, that is a linguistic signal to group behavior toward others. It correlates it to internal hierarchies in the group. And so when we say cohesion, often, at least even in the academy, our descriptions of a community are binary, which I think is inadequate. We think, well, cohesion means a tight community. What we're finding is not either or. There are two kinds of cohesion, I think, that we're seeing. And my colleagues can clarify this. One is a cohesion whose signal is top-down autocratic imposition on others. And that kind of hierarchy of behavior regularly appears behind what we're calling ones. When people are using one definition, is out of fear of not saying the right one, as opposed to the kind of relational, again, I don't like the cohesion's a tight word, but if you think of relational community among those that we're marking 3, 4, or 5, those are the kinds of community that Zane had described that traditional seminarians have. And it's not top down, it's scripture up. And well, I'll stop there with that and see if Zane will pick that up, and then maybe Paula.
No, I mean, very little to add, because that, first of all, Mika's question really gets to the heart of things.
Yeah, it does.
The narrative analysis thing, I think, is a level of complexity. It would take a while to spell it out, so I won't go too deep into that. But I will say this much, Mika, that with the group that we saw, I think a traditional seminary is a very good example. And I'll compare it to the other one that we saw, which I also mentioned, which is those religiously inclined groups that were trained in engineering environments, like engineering universities and liberal arts universities. The former, you'd see those usages come out. They talk about jihad in ways that you would immediately say, well, that's fairly violent. But when you looked at how they ended up engaging on that term, when someone would ask them, they'd be very open to tolerating multiple ways in which that word would play out in their group, and they'd reason with their students. So if someone wants to, know what to do in a given situation, you'd end up with 2 or 3 options rather than sort of one singular kind of, one party line that you have to absolutely follow and put a flag in the sand. Not so with the others. When they exhibited a certain kind of monochromatic, like a one-colored, way in which they would approach the meaning, even if the meaning was sometimes not violent. So, for instance, if they insisted that jihad is just about personal internal struggle, and it's not about that militant stuff, when you put them in environments where they have to actually, engage in dialogue across differences, it really breaks down. You can see that there's, the spikes happening, the dips happening, there's stuff happening that is precursors, we feel, to eventual violence down the road. So just to tell you how that application comes in practice.
Great, thanks. Paul, why don't you go ahead and ask your question to us all?
Was
I
that
think
for
I have a number of
Paul or
questions.
Paula?
Go ahead, Paul.
Paul Turner.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry, just trying to make sure I wasn't stepping on anyone's toes. I was just, I had a couple of questions that, as I was just kind of reflecting on it, and one, I was just curious as to any interactions, positive or negative, kind of within places where this has been applied, as they learn, kind of as the broader community picks up and hears about this. I just would be a little bit interested to hear, are people perplexed and curious? Are they scared? Do they feel like Big Brother has cracked their code? I think it could be picked up in a lot of different ways. And just, it wasn't a leading question at all. Just curious. And then also, just had a quick reflection in that there's another organization that in what started out as research around kind of radicalization, they did a lot of research into kind of the language that could be anticipated and what was meant through search terms online, and were then able to kind of gin up something called the redirect method. So as people were looking to delve into more of the recruitment propaganda from ISIS, they were kind of able to funnel them into other types of information that they could access. But yeah, and just curious to see if you think this will get picked up more. So happy if you pick up any or all of those questions or share some more. But thanks so much for the presentations today.
Okay, Peter, I want to start with you, and then we'll roll around.
Yeah, I'll start briefly. Paul, it's wonderful questions. I'll defer to Zane or Paula about what happens when groups hear that we're doing this. And we're usually doing it not as Americans in behalf of some organization, but our field workers can describe that. Let me just refer to the last thing you raised, Paul. I want to say that our approach is non-semantic, or maybe you assume that. We haven't found it valuable for the way we're doing things. I'm not saying it isn't valuable for other goals. we haven't found it valuable to look for, let's say, what are the words ISIS is using to attract people. Instead, and we've studied ISIS texts pretty thoroughly, and they mark out pretty, in a surprising way, like Westboro Baptist Church, they have some of the lowest numbers. That is, sometimes we define them as below 1, meaning if a 1 means people only use one term, below 1 means how will you be hurt or killed if you use 2 terms. That is, if you misuse the dominant autocrats' definitions. At the same time, because there's such sophistication, ISIS members had such online sophistication, their texts would appear to be highly multivalent. They would appear to have 8 different meanings. And we had to create a whole new tool to identify groups that initially look like 1s and 9s at the same time. And I won't go into details of that. But again, that's because our method is not semantic. We're not looking for bad words that attract people, which one would want to do if you're looking to see how ISIS is recruiting other groups. Our goal is to signal peacekeepers, peace builders, if they should watch out or not. Zane?
So yeah, a lot to work with there. I don't think I can get in. There's so much that I could say about the ISIS example because he started it in depth. And just to sort of reiterate what Professor Oakes is saying, that's exactly the case. There's a nuanced hierarchy in the way they employ what might appear to be multiplicities of meanings, but really they're all part of one big package that means one thing: get out there, pledge allegiance, and fight. Right? And so the way that works is, we can't go into the details. I would love to have that conversation, Paul, maybe on a separate occasion, or perhaps if you could reach out and I could reach out, we could connect on it. But I want to address the other thing I think is very important. For me, at least, it's extremely important, which is how communities responded. And it's a great question, because we did worry about this a bit in the beginning. We found something very surprising, which is that, and particularly when we talk to seminarians or those who have traditional, let's say, traditional religious education, but for others too, but those groups in particular, they're actually extremely welcoming and open and extremely excited. In fact, most of the people that we got to do the analysis for us, our field workers in essence, were drawn from them. We ended up training them because they liked it and they enjoyed the way it alerted them to their own, their own texts, the way they were functioning with their own language. And I think part of the reason for this is because if you just take a sense of what it means to have those 4 or 5, the middle of the roaders that we talked about, they're open to communicative ways of learning new things in dialogue while sticking true to their identity and without sort of faltering in the face of those conversations, dissolving or converting, in other words. And so they ended up being sometimes critical, but mostly very cooperative, and they ended up becoming part of our team. So in a sense, I mean, there's another study to be written and talked about, which is how this could itself be a peace building sort of tool, training in that respect. So I hope that sort of gives you a sense of it. But that doesn't mean that there are, let's not forget that we're not really employing at this point hot button sort of, institutes that might set people off in a country like Pakistan, who come in and, have that label of identity across their forehead. So there are limitations, I imagine, to this observation on my part as well. I hope that gives you some sort of, insight into how things worked out. I should also say, just in parting, that the other groups, they were also not necessarily resistant, just perhaps not as excited or overjoyed over time, but still very cooperative. So again, I think as a science, it's much more engaging, it's much more dialogic, and it's much more open to building long-term relations because of the training and because of the intensive relationship building across time.
Paula Pinzon?
I believe we have 2 questions on the chat bill from Madeline and Chloe that we can maybe respond. I don't have anything. I believe Professor Oakes and Zane responded perfectly to that question. Happy to read some of the questions, unless Madeline or Chloe, you want to ask them directly. If not, I'm happy to read them from the chat.
Sure, I'm fine with going. Hi, this is Madeline. I was wondering if there's a difference in the type of insights yielded by analyzing findings from focus group discussions versus social media posts, and if perhaps one source is preferred over the other, or maybe a mixed methods approach is better for getting a more holistic picture.
Do you want to start, Paula?
Yes, I can start. I would say, and happy to have Sane and Professor Oakes correct me if I'm wrong, but from my recollection, when we've done it, we haven't seen a big difference in terms of the type of groups. Right at the end of the day, it's about the values versus, at the end of the day, the method in which you're analyzing those texts, whether it's written, whether it's interactions, whether it's in a group setting and in a live conversation. At the end of the day, you're still using the same science in a way to get into the values and the different meanings. So not from my experience, no differences that I've observed.
Um, yeah, if I could, I think take this. It's a good question because I think minor differences do exist, which we found. For one, focus group discussions, because they got really intense. When we tested this in the field, we did a number of exercises, some of which were also looking to test trigger events or trigger topics or hot button topics and how they responded to that. Some of which was also sort of sequestering to see how intergroup dynamics played out between different kinds of group formations. So I think it gave a more rich and textured sort of data on some counts, and it led to better sort of outcomes in terms of the long-term sort of relations that we were able to have with the groups. But in terms of the actual judgments on what we call the SRA, which is the number of meanings assigned to a value term and what that predicts, no real difference, because when you look at the data, you might have richer data, but the end outcome in terms of what we were able to get from it, more or less the same, and we didn't see too much of a variation. In effect, the data acceleration, which we haven't talked much about today, but is a very, I think, very effective tool, because we were sometimes able to go search up to, I don't know, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Oaks, but it's something like 300, 400 documents for a given group as well. As sermons, particularly, I think
Oh,
broadly data,
more than
and
that.
more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think 600 and so. And so when you have that large a data set, really those variation, what you miss out on with the more layered and textured group discussion, it sort of washes over because of how over time, how statistically accurate you can get. So yeah, I hope that answers the question somewhat.
I'm just add a word to that. I mean, I don't know if Mark or Bill have a response. This is a weird science that we've engineered out of ethno-linguistic studies. By weird, I mean we're getting results that we were so surprised to see. And I'll add one more feature. The results are subjective. We found that when, for example, there are times when we're hiring 100 undergraduates to help follow our analysts and carry out some of the analyses. If the analysts themselves were treating this too objectively and they were trying to get it right, the data was skewed. I'm not explaining everything I'm saying, but values are warm things that require feeling them as well as thinking them. And I just want to say that subjective, warm sources of data have yielded remarkably consistent results over years of study. That's something you'd have to pursue later to challenge us on that, but it's worth you're all noting that down. Other folks, Paula, Bill.
Okay, other questions? Paula, you have any other questions you see out there in the
Yes,
chat?
I see a question from Chloe. Chloe, happy to read it unless you want to ask it directly as well. I believe it's a follow-on to Maddie's point. I believe, Chloe may have left the chat, but I can still ask it and we can open it up.
Okay.
Thanks to the speakers and to tag on Madeline's point, has it been difficult ensuring that the right people are in the room and willing to participate in the focus group discussions?
Good. Okay, we'll start with Zane here. Did you get the right people in the room?
Yeah, I think it did take some doing in various contexts, and in other contexts, not any doing at all, because remember that we're also doing the data acceleration, and so much is really available online as well. But on the FGD front, the focus group discussion front, back in Pakistan, it did take a bit of engineering, a bit of working out contacts, contacting the right people, and so on. But we found that once you get started, there's actually a lot of interest. There's also a lot of, for lack of a better word, affinity, that people feel for the science. So if we, like I mentioned, with certain seminarians, when we discussed what the science was, it really resonated. and I think in a sense, it also resembled some of their own internal, the more scholastic part of what traditional scholastic study in the seminaries look like on certain fronts. Oddly enough, and we can talk a lot about that on a separate occasion. I don't think we can go into the details right now. But to answer more sort of, more in a more, I suppose, more focused way, in I think most contexts with most of the groups we work with, it didn't take too much doing. Some of them it did take a bit of doing. And I think with others, it took absolutely no doing. They really reached out themselves. Journalists, for instance, were really interested right off the bat. Some of the traditional seminarians were very interested. Some of the dissident ones were very quizzical and then critical, and then later somewhat sort of lukewarm. And then finally, they jived with it too. So different responses, different orientations. Overall, I would say quite efficient and fairly easy. But it does take a bit of doing, training them up, sharing your thoughts, telling them what the science is. And we were very open with disclosure. We would say straight up, this is what we do, this is what we think, this is how we feel about it, this is our science. Hid nothing, and I think it really made it a more well-oiled experience as far as that's concerned.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. Maybe we can go back to the question I asked the good professor a while ago.
Let's call
It's
me
about-
Peter. There's a little bit of inequality here. Yes.
Uh-huh. That
Okay.
about the back end of the process, about the data part of the process.
Remind me again, a couple of our sentences that you asked about the back end.
Well, I mean, folks collect things in the field, and then what happens
Okay,
between that and the recommendation?
gotcha. Again, we're only describing one of the tools, and when we're doing semantic range, if we're doing it in person, that is through focus groups, and we've done that with up to 50 persons from several different groups working in focus groups and so forth. Our first need is to make sure the focus group works together to learn how to do this. But then the key is that each individual is filling out some forms apart from the others, because what we're doing, we're not asking an individual, do you think there's many meanings to this term? We're asking an individual, what do you think this term means? And we're ourselves seeing when the individual members of a focus group hand in their data, we see that when we collect them, we see that 3 members of the focus group said the same thing, but the focus group also had a lot of differences. So first to establish that. What we do next, in Pakistan, the data is coming in Urdu, and the initial judgments are made by focus group leaders in Urdu. Then the material is translated, sent over to our senior analysts and our undergraduate assistants, so there may be 50 of them. And they're getting it in English, and they're simply collecting the quantitative implications of the data. What's the range? And what we haven't gone into today, because we just can't, is we're not just taking this data down as it comes. Another factor is how often are they meeting, with whom are they meeting, what are the external situations, and we're taking all these different factors into account, but we can't go into that right now. So in the English-speaking analysts are then collecting the numbers, after which the analysts then reappear and make initial predictions based on the evidence. A last stage of study, which is extensive, but we won't describe too much, Paolo, right? Is that we have to test whether or not the data would enable us in the field to predict group behavior. And to do that, we spent, I think, 3 years or so with groups we worked to before. We re-examined them, putting them artificially into environments of tension with each other, and then testing our own ability to anticipate how they would act under those circumstances. But I think I'll just say that for now. Paolo, do you want to add a word to that, or no?
No, I think no, wouldn't add anything. I believe we don't have any other questions unless anyone else has any other questions.
I have a question too. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Go ahead, Mika.
So it seems like a key part of the data necessary for VPA is focus groups, right? What I'm wondering, oh no, okay. Well, let me finish my question anyhow, then you can answer. um, can and has this been used to predict behavior of online violent groups? So like groups that exist solely in chat and things like that.
I'll just first explain my shaking my head, Zane, and then I'll turn it over to the two of you. When we're doing research funded by, let's say, a Pakistani government agency or by others, we have the leisure to take time and develop focus groups. That builds up our capacity and enables us to have models that we can then use and test. But in action, in conflict environments, we don't always have that leisure. And online analyses, data analyses, and then indirect things like interviewing folks from a neighboring group when that's the best you can do. And finally, because we can't always rely on focus groups, we've had to develop new tools that we use for different kinds of data, for example, written texts that we can collect in a variety of different ways, independently of focus groups and so forth. I'll just mention that for now, Mika, with more detail coming from later or from my colleagues here.
Yeah, I think just pretty much that, to pick up from where you left off, Professor Oaks. Mika, I think first of all, I just sort of highlight that fact. We're thinking in terms of practical applications all the time, right? So a lot of what I discussed, for instance, in the field applications in Pakistan, were building up to precisely that. So the earlier phases were a bit more, like Professor Oaks described, leisurely, and we had the luxury at that time. But eventually, it builds up to having those tools ready for for deploying. And I think the way we imagine this is that there are practical applications that are, they're capable of being sensitive to multiple contexts. Context, for instance, in which you need to take care of medium-term, stabilities operations in areas that are trying to rebuild after conflict. Spaces in which you really need to get ahead of detecting, what's coming up ahead in the immediate future. Spaces where you want long-term sort of, arrangements to rebuild ties in a longer-term sense, and which are not, let's say, immediate hotbed, but tense situations. And then likewise, many other such differentiations across the kind of context that you can call conflict zones. And so I think, the data is dependent on those contexts. And we know what we've been doing a lot of is testing to ensure that if you have these variant kinds of data boxes and data sort of methods, you may have the luxury of going mixed method in one, and other you might have to be reliant on one kind. Does the effect wash over, or does it hold? Does your predictive capacity stay? And we found that it does stay. And so some of the things that we worked on, which is the text mining stuff, the big data stuff, we were looking at precisely the sort of thing you would today describe as social media platforms. Although a lot of them were also sort of online magazines in more dedicated senses. For instance, ISIS is one, but there were others that were also Facebook groups and so on and so forth. So I think just to answer your question, it is mixed method, but it doesn't mean that we're reliant on any one. And it also doesn't mean that we are blind as to the context within which kind of data would be most relevant or most workable.
Paula, you have anything to add?
I would agree. I would echo what Sane and Peter said. We, in fact, did, I think, part of when I first joined VPA and started doing the reports and the analysis, it was a lot of it was from online groups. One that comes to mind is a group that you would see that, Sane, remind me of the shepherds, the Sea Shepherds. They're an online group, or not an online group, but they're an environmental activist group that oppose sort of a lot of the things that happen with dolphins and animals and just in the ocean. And you would think, right, that a group that is advocating for that tended to be very peaceful. And in fact, a lot of the words that we would see online in sort of their articles and even in social media groups of what they wrote tended to echo that. But then there were actions that in fact turned to be violent. So we were able to see that correlation. So I would say it's both, as Sane was saying, you can just get different things from both the focus group, the live session, but also you're able to do a lot of the data and get a lot of the data and prediction from online groups and social media groups.
There are also, if you permit me just another couple of moments on this, there are also indications, and we have developed a capacity to think through these metrics as well. For instance, take a group like TM, Transcendental Meditation, or Yogaville, which is again oriented towards spiritual, new spiritualism, and so on. You find that a lot of their work, that their most read stuff, is really in these sort of, one might say, these virtual spaces, because they don't have an on-ground sort of, and this gets to your comment on the chat, Mika, somewhat, that kind of group cohesion on ground. And so one of the things we've learned to do is also to see how the method is sort of tailor-made to reflect what the nature of the group is. And so in one sense, we've also developed the capacity to sort of triangulate those kind of judgments. And just to also answer, Mika, what you put in the chat, which I think was a really fascinating comment. We really don't have time, I think, to get into the details of that, the nitty-gritties, although I would love to talk at length about this issue of cohesion and communication, for instance. But I do want to mention that we did do precisely those kind of experimental analyses in Pakistan earlier on, where we purposely inhibited or sometimes even sparked, kind of conflict between groups. And we studied what happened to the language. And then we compared it to baseline, and then we used it to forecast and then tested the forecast about how they would respond when another similar issue came up with a similar place group. I'll give you a small illustration. Take a Deobandi or a Barelvi group, and they'll be very, very on board with each other on certain issues, and certain other issues they may not. And once you get a sense of what those issues do to the language, you're probably able to see or predict what kind of responses they would be, and disambiguate between, what one might say, multiple postures of antagonism. It's not enough to say, well, they're antagonistic, that drew antagonism. No, you want to go into the detail. What kind of antagonism is it? Maybe they just want to talk. Maybe they just want to have a debate. And that's actually part of the culture of South Asian dialogue amongst them. And that allows us to sort of be more nuanced in what we predict and what we hope to sort of strategize with such groupings. I hope that sort of answers some of that question. And thanks a lot for that comment, by the way.
Could I add a closing sentence from my voice, Bill?
Yeah, go ahead.
To those who are still here, thank you so much for joining us, and do be in touch if you have suggestions. I see some in the chat group. I may have to write you back about them. But one thing I think would be good to emphasize: our work in developing new tools is not for the sake of an academic. Although we are writing essays to explain our method, we're not judging our method by its attempt to make academic clarity of what groups are doing. What we try to do is to generate evidences that would be sufficient to stimulate peace builders or peacekeepers to act in certain ways in real time. So the goal is like an early warning sign, but an early warning sign not just of bad guys, good guys, of a range of different possibilities in the field that folks who do peace building wouldn't be aware of except for these signals. But it's not to be tested by empirical truth. Was that group really like that? It's to be tested by the success or failure of peace builders who use this data to act in certain ways to ameliorate tension.
Thank you, Peter. For those faithful who have stuck with us here, are there any other questions or observations that you have? Just come up and let us have a question or discussion. Mika, do you have anything else?
Yeah, well, I'm just full of questions. I love learning about this and hearing everything that you guys are talking about. Peter, what you say about the goal not necessarily being to achieve empirical truth, proof is in the pudding, right?
Yes.
And I think that for those in the field with an academic background, sometimes so like myself, sometimes I forget. No, I don't forget, that the proof is in the pudding. But it's easy to get, driven down like, oh, well, we got to rule out this possibility in order for it to be, rigorous and for it to be proven and so on and so forth. And so I'm thankful that you bring us back to there's going to be complications. It's not going to be a perfect experimental design. But if it benefits the practitioners, then that's what we're going for, like that is the goal in the end. So I'm thankful that you brought us back to that. I would also ask, I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with work on identity fusion and intragroup cohesion or not, but that might be something to look into as well. Anyhow, I'll leave it at that, and I'll reach out to you guys later offline. Thank you very much.
Mick, yeah, I'd like to speak to you. I think we all would offline, but just one sentence about empirical. It's my own experience with very sophisticated research groups who do analyses for State Department and so forth. I feel on the issue that we're speaking about, identity groups, I think there's often a danger analytically in the attempt to use a causal model, which to me is 19th century logic, but anyway, to use a causal model to say, what were the factors that led to violence? And we want to develop programs that would eliminate those factors. With regard to identity group, inter-identity group violence, I don't see evidence that those are successful approaches. And that's another reason why we're saying that the proof is in the pudding, because that's where the actual evidence is, that there are signals that suggest it's valuable to work now with these groups in certain ways. That could be much more reliable evidence than the evidence that purports to say we've captured the cause and now we're going to recommend how to get rid of that cause. I don't think those usually work very well in real conflict. But more for later.
Okay. Well, if we have nothing else, let me put up the screen here to let everyone see our contact information. So if you want to contact us or have discussions, why don't you use this opportunity to copy down what you need to copy down on there, and be more than happy to open a dialogue and share information that you have and best practices that you have seen and you're working with. Because we're all out here to refine what's the best approaches to solving these problems, so that better outcomes can be achieved, and so that also risk can be minimized, which is the other thing we actually haven't talked about, but that is another thing. This can minimize risk in knowing what groups you can work with, what individuals you can work with, and if while working with them, if things begin to shift and that group begins to become more strident in their approaches. So take a look at this list here for a while, and the general contact information at the bottom. And once you get that all copied down for whatever you want, I will go ahead and close that slide here soon. And if there are no other questions, we will wish everyone farewell. And we certainly appreciate you giving time at this last moment of the conference, where we're glad you were able to sustain your enthusiasm and your energy to join us at this last moment.